Random House Audio presents The Big C, an autobiography by Langston Hughes, read for you by Dominic Hoffman, with an introduction written and read by Arnold Rampersad.
Introduction. Langston Hughes was for some time a reluctant autobiographer. Although he published The Big C in 1940 when he was only 38, he was first asked seriously to write such a work when he was just past 23 in 1925. To help his mentor Carl Van Vechten with his introduction to Hughes's first book of poetry, The Weary Blues, 1926, Hughes had sent L'Histoire de ma vie, a brief but dazzling essay that set off a brainstorm in Van Vechten. Yes, the publisher Alfred A. Knopf, who was about to bring out Hughes's first book of poems, and he completely agreed Hughes should do an autobiography at once. But Hughes did not like the idea. "I hate to think backwards," he explained. "It isn't amusing. I am still too much enmeshed in the effects of my young life to write clearly about it. I haven't escaped into serenity and grown old yet. I wish I could. What moron ever wrote those lines about carrying me back to the scenes of my childhood?" By 1939, when he sat down at last to write his autobiography, he was presumably no longer so enmeshed in the effects of my young life that he could not write clearly about it. Moreover, he was no longer so young. After The Weary Blues had come another volume of verse, Fine Clothes to the Jew, in 1927, then a novel, Not Without Laughter, 1930, a collection of stories, The Ways of White Folks, 1934, a collection of radical verse, A New Song, 1938, and a long-running Broadway play, Mulatto, 1935, in addition to other produced plays and lesser publications. More important, by the time the adult mask, so carefully constructed to conceal the effects of my young life, was firmly in place. In 1939, Langston Hughes was internationally known as a leftist radical, a proudly racial poet, and a daring world traveler who had spent a year in the USSR, then come home via China and Japan. Nevertheless, some friends saw a puzzle in his personality. At one level, Langston was the ever-smiling, often laughing, boon companion. At another, he was unfathomable. One fictional portrait, drawn in the 1920s by the black novelist Wallace Thurman, had him as the most closed-mouthed and cagey individual the narrator had ever encountered. When it came to personal matters, he fended off every attempt to probe his inner self, and did this with such an unconscious and naive air that the probers soon came to one of two conclusions. Either Hughes had no depth whatsoever, or else he was too deep for plumbing by ordinary mortals. The German intellectual Arthur Koestler, who had roamed with him in Central Asia during several weeks in 1932, would report that behind the warm smile of his dark eyes there was a grave dignity and a polite reserve which communicated itself at once. He was very likable and easy to get on with, but at the same time one felt an impenetrable, elusive remoteness which warded off all undue familiarity. On the surface, the purpose of autobiography is to reveal. On the other hand, it is a commonplace that significant autobiographies begin under unconscious orders from the autobiographer. What were Hughes's orders, insofar as we can guess them? Two, perhaps, were more important than all others. First, Hughes, who depended almost desperately on the smiling surface he offered to the world, had to preserve that face even as he expressed as an artist some intimation of psychological depth that could come only from the recitation of varied and trying experiences, in short, from the revelation of conflict and unhappiness. Second, and more telling, Hughes, who for certain intimate reasons craved the affection and regard of blacks to an extent shared by perhaps no other important black writer, had to compose a book that would speak not only to whites who published and bought books, who made books possible, but also to blacks. and yet the message of a black writer to whites and the message from the same writer to blacks are often not only different but contradictory. His loving sense of a black audience led to problems from the start. When Blanche Knopf read the first draft of The Big Sea, she found tedious the long Harlem Renaissance section that comprises the second half of the book. It was too full of Carl Van Vechten, Wallace Thurman, Jean Toomer, and so on, until it became a sort of Harlem cavalcade, which is wrong. In response, he vigorously defended the details of Harlem life as the background against which I moved and developed as a writer, and from which much of the material of my stories and poems came. No doubt some small portions of it may have vital meaning only to my own people, but these portions would add to the final integrity and truth of the work as a whole. I am trying to write a truthful and honest book. Black readers would certainly give me a razzing if I wrote only about sailors, Paris nightclubs, etc., and didn't put something cultural in the book, although the material is not there for that reason, but because it was a part of my life, and the fault lies in the writing if I have not made it live. Largely at the insistence of Van Vechten, almost all the cuts were restored. Langston was the last historian of that period who knows anything about it, Van Vechten declared, in urging Hughes to expand rather than trim the section, which is now generally recognized as the finest first-hand account of the Harlem Renaissance in existence. But Hughes's attempt to reach the black reader went further than such sections. That The Big Sea is a tour de force of subterfuge is strongly suggested by the conflicting contemporary reviews of the book. Most alertly, the New York Times Book Review saw both sides. The work was both sensitive and poised, candid and reticent, realistic and embittered. Where the Times saw substantial bitterness, however, the New York Sun noted that Hughes does not allow much bitterness to creep in, and another reviewer urged whites to read it because it is true and honest and not bitter. Whereas in The Nation, Oswald Garrison Villard spoke of Hughes's absolute intellectual honesty and frankness, elsewhere Alan Locke lamented that Hughes had glossed over too many important matters. The radical Ella Winter found him too gentle with us white folks. Ralph Ellison, then a Marxist, complained that too much attention is apt to be given to the aesthetic aspects of experience at the expense of its deeper meanings. He further questioned whether the style was appropriate to the autobiography of a Negro writer of Hughes's importance. Another radical was shocked to notice not a single mention of a radical publication you've written for, or a single radical you have met or who has meant anything to you. In the New Republic, Richard Wright praised Hughes as a cultural ambassador who had carried on a manly tradition in literature when other black writers have gone to sleep at their posts. In calling Hughes a cultural ambassador, however, Wright invited memory of a passage in his most important essay, Blueprint for Negro Writing, where he had scorned past black writing in general as the prim and decorous ambassadors, the artistic ambassadors who went a-begging to white America in the knee-pants of civility. In The Big Sea, deeper meaning is deliberately concealed within a seemingly disingenuous, apparently transparent or even shallow narrative. In a genre defined in its modern mode by confession, Hughes appears to give virtually nothing away of a personal nature. In fact, only 3 admissions in the work qualify as autobiographical exposé, but the meaning of even these episodes is easily lost in the autobiographer's deliberately disingenuous design. The first is in Hughes's boyhood, when, after waiting trustingly for Jesus to come to him at a religious revival, he fakes a conversion, then weeps far into the night in guilt and shame. The second in his adolescence, and almost cheerfully advanced against a background of Mexican technicolor, concerns Hughes's brutal feelings for his father.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?